If the audience could see me blinking right now, besides behind these sunglasses, I didn't like it. I was like livid.
So the fact that she was like, he brought in 8 players as if he like changed the whole
Yeah.
team. No.
Just
There is an interesting story there of
yeah, there
tension with the
definitely
front
is.
office and this once in a lifetime player and how to maximize it.
I think there should be more pressure on Calvin Booth this season because you had your gap year. Now it's time for some of these moves to start panning out or to pivot. Is Zeke Naji the best example of that? Zeke Naji.
If anything, he should be the single thing they agree about right now, that he's getting paid way too much.
He's being reasonable here, and Malone is not. Like that's what someone who didn't know anything about the situation read this article. That's what you had to take away from it.
Let's jump into the Ramona Shelburne article, which was kind of dropped out of nowhere in a way, where she did this extensive almost look at the front office where it seemed like she talked to Calvin Booth and was even in the office because she described like details
She described
of his office.
the office. Yeah.
And Malone was talked to, Jokic was talked to, MPJ, different quotes.
Was Malone talked to?
I don't know if he was talked to, actually. I just know that there was like a section where she talked about Malone and then Booth talked about Malone. So maybe he didn't say anything. But I read the article and I was just looking for quotes from Calvin Booth and Jokic and the players just to see what they're saying, because that's not going to be colored by Ramona's opinions. And she's based in LA. She's close with the Warriors and the Lakers and the Clippers. Not that she hates the Nuggets, but sometimes I suspect her intentions. So I wasn't too offended by the article, though there's been plenty of speculation about whether this was almost like a Booth orchestrated piece to prop himself up and take some of the pressure off with regards to the roster and Jokic's prime, which is what this article was framed around, was, are the Nuggets wasting his prime? And you had messaged me and said, we got to talk about this on the show because you were fired up about it.
My messages on the show.
Well, I just you had expressed that you were maybe you were feeling some type of way about it, and I wasn't necessarily having a strong feeling against it, even though it was discussed on Twitter quite a lot. So why don't you start out with your feelings on it, and let's get into this.
If the audience could see me blinking right now, besides behind these sunglasses, I woke up on Friday morning because that's when this article dropped. And just so people understand my routine, I like to go on Twitter first thing and just like clear my notifications because I don't like having the little bubble on there. Had some people tagging me in their thoughts on the article and that kind of thing. I was like, oh, there's an article. All right, what's going on here? So I read this thing first thing in the morning and I was like livid. And we're gonna get into the meat of this article, but a lot of my issue with it wasn't what was said, or like in particular the quotes that are gotten from the players, or even from Calvin Booth in the article. Ramona puts her own spin on it because she's writing about the team and all of that, but it's a lot of what isn't said, because like you mentioned, this is really framed around the idea of the team wasting Jokic's prime, but it very much seemed like certain members of the team or the organization were getting a lot more sympathy in the framing of this article than others. And the others in particular, I think, were Malone. We're going to go through a couple of examples where it seems that the perspective in this article was very much skewed toward looking at the roster building methodology of Calvin Booth in the most positive possible light, and even going beyond what I think would be like plausible given what we know about some of the players on the team and their ability to contribute on a certain timeline, to contribute to not just winning, but to a championship team. And the more I read and the more sympathetic view the article took of that particular thing, coupled with some valid critiques of Michael Malone, it just felt incredibly one-sided, and I didn't like it. I mean, so let's get into it. One of the first things that we learn, or I don't remember the order of this that they appear in the article. Well, one of the big important things that we learn in the article, just factually, is that Calvin is currently in the process of negotiating a contract extension
Oh yeah, that
with
was surprising.
ownership, and that was in the article. So maybe that actually doesn't come till toward the end, but you get to that point, and then everything else about it makes sense. So that's number one. There's this line actually that I found to be an interesting, if it was, Ramona's sort of spin on things, it felt like an interesting sort of perhaps over characterization of the power that Booth has. Let me read the
Okay.
quote for you. It's when she's in Calvin's office and she's describing it. She said, "But the rest of the office is empty, suggesting there's still much to accomplish. Booth will be the chief architect of whatever comes next, as the Nuggets have for months been speaking to him about a contract extension," multiple sources said, "and a deal is expected soon." So that description of Booth as the chief architect of whatever comes next, what's your reaction to that?
Well, the first reaction was the news that he may be getting an extension because I was thinking of this
I feel
season
like
as,
suit, apparently.
yeah, expecting it soon because I didn't think that would happen this season at all because we would have to see what happens this season with the young players that he got and whether this plan is working. We're going to theoretically get more answers to that this season, I would think,
Yeah.
because now's the time. If we lose this season, we can track how Piwat was doing, how Strother was doing, how CB was doing in the starting lineup, and then assess. Because I thought if we go out in the playoffs in some embarrassing fashion, something's going to change, whether it's a roster or a coach or even Booth himself. So I thought he wouldn't be getting an extension until at least after this season, you know? So the grand architect line, though, doesn't really surprise me because, yeah, he's the GM. So if they're extending him, then he's going to be the one architecting the next direction of the team. So that doesn't surprise me. It's just the fact that we're like committing to him before even knowing how this two timeline thing is really going to shake out.
Yeah. No, that was definitely my first reaction to just the extension piece of it. I do think that the architect line was, again, these are Ramona's words. My thing is that whenever it's clear that like it was arranged for Ramona to interview Calvin as like the main kind of centerpiece of this article, is like, oh, okay, but I have to get like the meat of this article has to be a lot of quotes from at least like one particular source. It just happened to be Calvin here. Like these aren't arranged by accident. Like we read the feature that Kevin O'Connor did on Calvin Booth, and it was a feature on him that also involved a very extensive interview with Calvin Booth. But he, of course, got quotes from others and brought them in as well. But these things are arranged like ahead of time. Like you kind of, if you have to know that if you're, in Calvin's position, in the team's position, that you're going to be contributing to something that isn't going to be like negative about, I would say not negative about the team, but we can talk about what this article actually accomplished in that regard. But is at least going to be like neutral to positive for you, which is what I think this article was trying to accomplish. But I honestly think it just pissed a lot of people off, myself included, because of how much it glazed over the limitations of this roster as a result of moves made by Calvin Booth. When I first read the line about him being the architect of whatever comes next, like, yeah, the GM is in charge of building the roster, but the coach, the coaching staff, whoever, the players are also involved in architecting like what you're going to see on the court. And it just had like a little, like the word architect just has a little too much in it in terms of like control over what like the word control just comes to mind there. And it's interesting that it came in the same sentence as talking about a contract extension. It hasn't happened yet. Like a deal is expected soon, but it hasn't actually happened yet. It's just a little grandiose for me. But again, I don't think necessarily that like word or even the tone of this article necessarily came from Calvin Booth, but I think that he's probably fine with it. Okay, so the other thing that we learn in the article factually is this quote from MPJ, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, he basically said we know if we don't win or compete, they might have to blow it up. You see this with other teams. It's not like players are oblivious to the way that this works, but just him acknowledging that is pretty. That was the most surprising thing to me reading the article. There's already rumors or fans calling for trades to be
I mean, that's been
happening.
going on forever with
Yeah,
MPJ. So.
right. Well, it just sucks because if we are going to trade someone, he's one of the first options you have to look at just because of his contract. But it's weird because we need shooting. He's a great shooter, but we have to trade him to get two shooters just so that we have more shooting? I mean, all those questions, we'll be talking about that all season long.
I mean, he didn't say that he'd be the one to be traded. Like the exact quote is, "If we don't win it this year, we all know they might have to break it up."
It's just like that the core four would be broken up in some way. And it's just
Mhm.
when I look at it, I'm thinking he's the
Yeah, I mean,
easiest
that's
one.
objectively
Yeah.
true. I'm just saying this
I
quote doesn't necessarily reveal his own mindset
right.
that deeply. Just that the players are aware of the pressure of the year, I would
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
right? Which is interesting. Like it's definitely weighing on them. We got some quotes even after this last game, this blowout win that they had against the Jazz that we're going to talk about from Julian, who talked about, the noise happening on the outside in contrast to about the team in contrast to how they're trying to keep things in the locker room and deal with things inside because they are still trying to find their identity as a team and they are still building. MPJ also had some quotes about how they are making, steps in that regard, but it's clearly something that they're aware of. And even like, our two shooters are the ones that reveal the most when it comes to these quotes to the press. But Julian revealing that tells me that there's a concerted effort within the locker room to not, drum up like drama or whatever. I don't think that MPJ saying this is necessarily that either. I don't know what the question was to him. This is not from a press conference. This was like probably some quote that Ramona got from him on the side. So that's like another piece of this. Like we don't know like what was asked, but he was honest and there's nothing like wrong about that. That's basically what everyone has been saying. It's just now we know that the players know too. Not that I ever thought that they didn't know, but it's different when something is like confirmed,
Yeah. You just don't
right?
see that every day.
Yeah.
The athletes saying it out loud.
The other thing that we learn factually in this article is that the organization is concerned with Jamal's conditioning again. So quoting from the article here, Denver expected he'd come into camp with something to prove. Instead, he has continued to struggle with his shot and his conditioning, sources said, concerning the Nuggets. So it's concerning New York as well. What was your reaction to that?
Definitely is concerning because I thought the same thing that Jamal would come into this season knowing he has to actually be sharp right off the bat and come out of the gate hot. And he knows what the narratives are around him I would assume. And I thought he'd be, I mean, I think everyone thought he'd be coming out to answer and to prove everyone wrong and to show that he's still one of the best players in the league, at least at his position. I don't know if Booth and Malone or it's just one of them that have,
Someone, source.
yeah, someone has concerns about conditioning. But yeah, I mean, his shot obviously is not there right now, and his decision making looks a little bit weird.
We got quotes from Malone during the preseason being concerned about the whole team's conditioning. But I think most of the time, Malone will do this thing where he's like, it's not just one guy, blah, 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 but he might have
Mm,
somebody particular in mind. And now we know it was definitely Jamal. And I always assumed that Jamal was going to be included in that bunch, but especially seeing everybody else through the first few games. Like, I don't think everybody's conditioning was like totally up to snuff, but it's particularly glaring with Jamal because it's just this consistent issue with him. I wouldn't say that I thought he was going to come into the season doing this. It's just that I thought that he needed to,
Yeah.
and he hasn't. Is how he's starting the season shocking to me? No, unfortunately, because that's where he has put the bar for some people. For other people, like they're completely like this is completely unacceptable, and it really should be, right? Like we talked about this. He needs to be better in the regular season, in particular because of his new contract, because the rest of the team is not going to have like that's just the reality of the current cap environment. Like if you wanted to coast through the regular season and just show up in the playoffs, I think you should have been ready to take a pay cut, right? Because you're not performing like a max player and you're clearly, if this is true, not planning to perform like a max player in the regular season. And that's not acceptable because like the playoffs are not the only thing that the team has to go through. And especially this team right now has to is trying to find itself and they need some help. We're going to get to talking about individual players' performances to start the season. But I would say that Jamal has been the most egregiously unacceptable relative to what the team needs from him, if you look at it that way, to start the season. He's currently in the concussion protocol, which we won't get into too many details about, but he did get a concussion in the middle of the Wolves game, missed the second half of that game, missed the Jazz game, and he's going to be out. I think Malone said the average time is 5 to 7 days. So not sure when he's going to be back, at some point, maybe by the end of this week, but that is not his fault at all. It's just like something, just something to mention because the rest of the team is going to have to, figure some things out without him. But when he comes back, like he's just got to be a lot better than he's been. I wanted to get to a couple of the quotes from the article that particularly ruffled my feathers because of the context that they lack. So again, a lot of my issue with this was the framing of, well, Booth's just doing the best that he can do, and Malone has all these things that he needs to do. And yeah, okay, let me just get into it. So the first one that stood out to me was actually this one about the situation that the team is in, that the front office is in with their constraints on the roster. And it's not a quote, but it's Ramona's framing. So everything here is going to be a mixture of Ramona's framing and quotes. But she says, these are the bets that have to work out for the long-term strategy to pay off. This is in reference to Zeke Naji, by the way, getting the deal that he got and then barely playing down the stretch of the season, not playing in the playoffs. But the one's hardest to stomach when you're up against a hard cap and your superstar is ready to win now. The reason that stood out to me is that it's very front office friendly to just be like, well, they have a hard cap. That's just kind of how things go. The second apron is not technically a hard cap, but it is true that a lot of teams around the league are treating it as one. And it's also true that the ownership voted for this, in addition to the Players Association voting for this, but it was the owners that were definitely pushing for the second apron as it currently is constructed because of how onerous it is. Teams are treating it as a hard cap. It just kind of tells you everything you need to know about how the rest of the article is going to go because it's already making excuses for the front office, right?
Before you go on, though, there was that one quote about Calvin Booth and his role in the championship team, and she wrote that Booth brought in 8 players. And the way that was framed, I thought was overstated, too, because, he traded for KCP.
Was it the 3-2 ways?
And then it's just like he added Bruce Brown, and it's some people don't even give him credit for the KCP trade because it was very quickly after Tim Connolly left. So people are left wondering how much Tim Connolly already kind of worked on that versus Booth just doing all of it himself. And I don't know that we'll ever know that unless someone comes out and says something about it. I don't think Booth created the championship team all on his own, obviously. So
Architected it well.
yeah. So the fact that she was like, he brought in 8 players as if he like changed the whole
Yeah.
team. No, no.
This was a very like, and this like, it's not surprising that ESPN is writing a fluff piece on a front office. Like, these are their sources for all of their little news alerts and all of this stuff, right? But this was just so, in my opinion, it was so heavy-handed just because of how one-sided it was. While this, it would be different if this was like a fluff piece about a team that's like doing well and they're rolling and they want to just give a bunch of credit to the GM. That's fine, right? But the article is framed as like the Nuggets are wasting Jokic's prime, which you can agree with or disagree with, but it can't be this guy's fault. It doesn't
Yeah.
go as far as to blame Malone outright most of the way, but it's a lot of implications for why the team like is struggling now, might struggle in the future, why they struggled in the playoffs.
It's things that the Nuggets media and fans have already known about, and we heard about the attention. We've already been asking questions about if they're wasting Jokic's prime. We've been talking about how to maximize Jokic. There is an interesting story there from a journalist standpoint of
Yeah, there
tension with the
definitely
front
is.
office and this once in a lifetime player and how to maximize it and how do you build a team around him and with these new cap restrictions. And she brought up the Warriors in comparison with Steph and them trying to do a similar thing with a whole 2 timeline plan. But yeah, there was a little bit of a slant there. I don't know if Malone reads that now he's mad because it's one of the first times that I've heard Booth mention the tension outright in this article. He said stuff about it in the end of season kind of press conference as well, and Malone and him both talked about it, but him referencing it again, like, yeah, there was tension there last season. Booth in the article also said that he was proud of what the team did last season because he said, yeah, there's pressure to win. We did really good in the regular season. And they didn't go as far in the playoffs as they wanted, but there was excuses for that too in terms of the Nuggets injuries and everything, and we've talked about that a ton. There was like a world where you can speculate the Nuggets could have won last season, which is pretty cool, but I
I
think
mean,
there'd
we
be
so
yeah,
I
I
know.
think I think there's almost more pressure this season because it's so hard to repeat, right? And we all kind of knew that, like we can win, but it's hard to repeat. This is the season where it's like you got to respond and show that you're a contender again, and maybe we're worse. Like so,
I
yeah.
think there should be more pressure on Calvin Booth this season because he and Josh Kroenke both, they came out at the on media day last year and said, if we get a title this year, which they obviously didn't, they were out in the second round. If we get a title this year, it would be stealing one. We kind of view this year as a gap year. And I'm like, all right, you had your gap year, right? Now it's time for, some of these moves that you made to start panning out or to pivot, right? That was the tone that they set. And that's where I think, and they might not actually view it that way, right? Like, these ownership and front offices can say lots of things about how, yeah, they're trying to be like super competitive now and they are all in on Nikola Jokic and all of this stuff, but then actually like some of these other constraints and the financials take precedence over even that behind the scenes, but they're never going to say that out loud, and that's fine. But the public discourse and dialogue should be based on holding them accountable for the things that they've said. There were lots of quotes about Malone's lack of trust in the younger players. I already talked about the first quote that was in reference to Zeke Naji, but here's another one. Naji is the Nuggets' fifth highest paid player and perhaps the best example of the disconnect between Booth's strategy and Malone's on-court decision making. Is Zeke Naji the best example of that? Because you would think if you want to make the case that like Malone just doesn't want to play young guys and Booth is like drafting these young guys that are going to be like helpful contributors, even if they need a little bit of development. Zeke Naji, he is in his fifth year in the NBA right now. And he was borderline unplayable for large stretches of last season by like any metric.
If anything, he should be the single thing they agree about right now that he's getting paid way too much and He shouldn't really be playing, or unless they have some plan to rehabilitate his value. And Booth's like, hey, you got to play him and rehabilitate him a bit. And Malone's like, hell no, I'm not playing him. But otherwise, they both should know that the contract is like a
It's
huge
not a good
issue
contract.
holding
Yeah.
the team back. So
The other one here, there was direct evidence of Malone's lack of trust in the younger players in that game 7. This is versus the Wolves. Only Christian Brown played meaningful minutes, and he had just 5 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists. Peyton Watson and Julian Strother didn't play. Will, based on how Peyton Watson was playing at the end of last season, particularly on offense, and based on, frankly, how Julian looks now, which is, I think, better than last year, particularly because of the efficiency, we'll discuss that. Do you think either of them would be ready to play playoff rotation minutes versus the Wolves in May?
no, I mean, Julian definitely wasn't. Peyton, we could have maybe played him more. It may not have worked out, but I didn't blame Malone that much for it, right? Like, it wasn't that big of a deal to me.
And I think that generally speaking, like that would have just been like a maybe not, like at best.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And I think most people agree that our issue in that series on the whole was the offense more than the defense, even though they had defensive issues like for stretches, especially at the beginning of that series. Then there was this whole section where they try to make like Calvin come off as like the good guy who is reasonable, and he's like he understands the position that Malone is in, which is like it might be true. Like that might be true. There might still be tension despite that being true. Booth understands the dilemma and doesn't hesitate to address the issues with how quickly Malone has integrated younger players, a common but delicate dance for championship level teams. Then it goes into a whole thing about with quotes from Calvin that are like, I like to see quotes where he's like, I understand like it's challenging for a coach, like they're trying to win games now. And it goes along with the quotes that they had at that end of season presser where they're like, look, front offices and coaches have different objectives, right? But we're trying to do, XYZ. Again, none of the actual quotes in this article bothered me. It's what isn't there. Because on the flip side, Ramona talks about Malone's public comments about the shooting. This was after, I believe it was after game 2 versus the Clippers, or maybe it was after game 1 versus OKC, where they like couldn't hit the broadside of a barn from 3 in particular. Where Malone said that the shooting had been a concern of his going into the season, which, by the way, he explicitly stated on media day was not a concern. We talked about how actually Calvin sees the shooting on the roster is more of a concern than Malone is willing to say publicly. But obviously they struggled with shooting in the preseason, so maybe he just kind of changed his mind, or he saw it all along, and was trying to play team ball. But he also mentioned, like, yeah, Christian is not KCP, but here's what he brings. And Ramona says, but public comments such as the ones Malone routinely makes, lamenting the loss of skill and experience he must replace, have done little to quell the tension. So it's just very like, well, Calvin Booth he's being reasonable here, and Malone is not. Like that's that's what someone who didn't know anything about the situation read this article. That's like what that's what you had to take away from it. I mean, I don't know how many people like don't know anything about the Nuggets situation that were reading this article. Like, if you don't know anything about the Nuggets situation, why are you reading an article about the Denver Nuggets? Like, this isn't, the Lakers or whatever that just get random casual media attention all the time. But it was very clear there was an agenda with this article, and I'm not saying necessarily that it was Calvin Booth's fault, but I also think he probably has no issue with this article as it's written.
Yeah, who's he trying to like appeal to? Like, because Nuggets fans already are pretty low on him, I would say, and the fans don't decide whether he has.
And I think this pissed off more people because of how one-sided it was.
Yeah, definitely. The temperature around Twitter, at least, was people being upset at Booth, which is usually the case whenever he talks. He's usually in some kind of hot water. So I don't know what the hell this one was.
Out of nowhere.
If he's just trying to appease the Cronkies with this or something, but like, why would he have to do that? Because doesn't he have a working relationship with him? I think most people are on Malone's side, though. I have been getting into some conversations with people about the lack of belief in Malone and
I'm already seeing
people.
people mad at Malone for not playing Zeke.
I know, yeah. That the first storyline of this season was the rotations aren't what we expected because he was still staggering Jamal, and then people were like, "What is Malone doing? Why doesn't he understand this already? And why isn't he quicker to get off of Saric or to not play this player, or whatever?" So people are low on Malone in some cases, but I'm still would always be Team Malone over Team Booth if I had to choose one. You hope that the front office and the coach can get along and we can be successful and have a happy working relationship and everything is great and cheery, of course, especially with Mike Singer now in there. Supposedly, I thought his whole job was going to be to rein Calvin in these press situations, but here we already have an article out in the early season. So maybe Mike Singer had something to do with this. Does he have a relationship with Ramona Shelburne or
He's
something?
the
I don't know.
director of intelligence, Will, not the director of fuzzy feelings. That's all I'm gonna
I don't know what that
say.
means though.
Me
Intelligence.
either. But it feels like this whole situation is like the opposite of what should be happening, regardless of whatever that position's supposed to be. No
Yeah.
offense, Mike.
Well, it did highlight a lot of the questions and tensions that we already have as fans that we will be talking about all season, but it did have a weird slant to it. All right. Thanks for listening, listeners. But as we say, many of you who are coming here, over half are not subscribed. So if you just found our show and you like what you hear, consider liking and subscribing because that will help us out a ton. Share, hit the notification bell on YouTube as well. Find us on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. Follow our Instagram and TikTok. It's all under What's in a Game NBA and our YouTube clip channel. Hopefully we'll come to you next time after some wins because winning is really fun and losing sucks.